Okay, so Michelle, are you seeing what you should be seeing?
Yep.
Terrific. Okie dokie. So we're going to start out here with talking about values, because really any change is going to be, any motivation needs to be based on what the person values. What I'm going to be sharing with you right now in terms of values, this is actually more informed by neurobiology and by acceptance and commitment therapy, but it gives us a place to start. So we got to start thinking about values, what the person really values, because if we want to support somebody with severe mental illness, one of the most important things that we can do in terms of facilitating recovery is to help that person explore what a meaningful life would look like, and then help that person to identify what it is that they truly value. So reconnecting to what you value and starting to move towards it really is at the heart of effectively using motivational interviewing techniques. So what are values? Well, human values are chosen patterns of behavior. So they're behaviors that you choose, and you construct those mentally, and then they can persist in your thoughts and your imaginations. Now, this is opposed to, some of you have been at some other trainings where we talk about all sorts of other ways in which you can learn something, or in which your behavior can be conditioned by. But values are where you have something in your mind that you're holding in terms of a best version of yourself, and you do that in your imagination. And then the behaviors that you're doing in the here and now can be coordinated and reinforced by that mental image that you're holding, rather than whatever short-term kind of contingencies that a person might be doing, in more, short-term types of behaviors, like drinking, for example. Or yelling at voices, or blah, 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 whatever somebody's doing in the moment that's not necessarily in alignment with who they see themselves as being at their highest and best self. So values are going to be dynamic, and they evolve from your own experience of what makes you feel the most alive, the most healthy, the most productive, and the most connected. So they provide you with a life direction. It's a little bit like having a North Star. Values are constructed based on your own reflections and memories, and then you can use those to project that into an imagined, compelling future. Again, it's just seeing yourself at your best. And then you can use that for a reference for what you're doing in the here and now, right? So if you see yourself at your highest and best, you're probably not passed out drunk, you're probably doing something amazing. And you can, again, use that as a reference for, okay, so what am I going to do in the here and now? Now, what I want you to see here is that this is actually rooted in human physiology. So your brain is doing mapping for you. And when you get something good or desirable, then there are going to be pathways that are going to encode models of behaviors that are based on a simple algorithm. This is how your nervous system does it. And that's going to include what to pay attention to, how to coordinate your body, so your motor functions of your body to move towards it. And then when those programs are activated, so when you're in contact with that and you're behaving consistently with it, then those behaviors that you're going to engage in are going to seem both effortless and pleasurable to you in the moment. So when you have behaviors that are consistent with what you truly value and you engage in those behaviors, then this brain circuitry is going to operate in the way it evolved to do, which is to move you effortlessly forward in a life forward direction towards your best self, even if the steps that you might be taking in the moment are difficult, challenging, or complex. So the way forward for us in our lives is to reconnect with what it is that we value personally, and then let our brains do what they were designed to do, which is to move us towards the best version of ourselves. Now, this might seem a little bit woo-woo, but that's literally what your brain evolved to do. And the motivational systems in your limbic brain, that's the emotional part of your brain that's underneath your cerebral cortex. These are some of the most ancient hardware, actually, of your brain. So they go back, these original circuits, these dopamine circuits in the brain, go all the way back to the first multicellular worms. And that is why I like to call this our worm brains. Okay, so we've got a few different pathways in the brain, again, that are going to be devoted to this motivational drive. And the motivational circuits in the brain, which are the mesolimbic, the mesocortical, and the nigrostriatal dopamine pathways, these are just dopamine pathways in the brain. Again, these run on a simple prediction algorithm. And that's going to be programmed by dopamine in your neurons, and that helps you anticipate what might be helpful for your organisms and the environment based on the genetic learning that's stored in your DNA, and that combined with your individual experience, right? So part of this is actually the way in which you create memories, right? So these dopamine circuits didn't evolve just to be stimulated when a person uses cocaine. They evolved to move you forward towards you at your best self. So when we get something that's good or desirable, when something happens in the environment that's amazing, then those circuits are going to encode the models of behavior that got you there based on that simple algorithm, including what to pay attention to. That's the mesocortical pathway there, and how to coordinate the motor functions of the body to move towards it. That's the nigrostriatal pathway. And then when these programs are activated, so when you engage in those behaviors, again, that's going to feel effortless and pleasurable. And that would be our good friend, the mesolimbic pathway, which we just commonly refer to as the reward circuit. So when we have these behaviors that are consistent with what it is that we truly value, and we engage in behaviors that are consistent with them, then these circuits can start to operate the way in which they were designed, again, which is to move us effortlessly towards our best selves. And again, that's even if the steps that we have to take are challenging or complex or difficult. Okay, so as I said earlier, these values, which continue to live in your worm brain, your brain has done this mapping for you. So they're going to be dynamic, and they're going to evolve from your own experience of what has made you feel alive, healthy, productive, and connected in the past. That's what they evolved to do. And they're going to provide you with that direction for your life, again, like like your own personal North Star. So values are constructed based on your own reflections and memories, and then that can be projected into an imagined compelling future and used as your reference for behaviors in the here and now. That's how it works. So there are values that are inherent to being a human being, and those are things such as, for example, having decent relationships, a place to call home, not just shelter, but a place where we feel like that we're at home. Meaningful work where we're productive, respected, and well treated. Our spiritual pursuits, our creative pursuits, intimacy, good times. These are all things that ping the worm brain. So again, that worm brain is going to run on a program that's in part shared by just our shared evolution as a species. So for human beings, what we have a tendency to value are the things that make us uniquely human. So those are our ability to connect with each other, to communicate, and to share, or to help, or to love, or to nurture, or to collaborate, to compete, or to creatively express. These are all things that are going to activate that reward circuit. So this is why a 5-year-old, that is a 5-year-old, right? If you walk up to a 5-year-old and ask them what they want to be when they grow up, they're not going to say, oh, what I'd really like to be is a heroin addict or somebody that just lays around on the couch all day. Even though maybe the journey of their lives have led them there, that's not something that they're using as a reference point for themselves at their highest and their best. So as long as the person's still breathing, then that 5-year-old is still living somewhere inside of them, and that's living inside of their worm brain. So while we manifest our values in unique ways, there's not going to be an infinite variation of what these human values are. And given the right circumstances, they're just going to positively manifest. Just like if you were to plant an acorn and you give it the right care, if it's in the right environment for acorn trees, then you're going to get an oak tree, right? It's just something that's inevitable. And where we have favorable and positive conditions, then we're going to naturally unfold our human potential through those things that we value as human beings. So the way in which this is expressed often in acceptance and commitment therapy is that our values are like a direction. So it's something like moving east, right? If I've got something that's providing me with a direction, then I can always do something to move towards it. You know, like I can walk towards it, or I can get in a bike and I can bike towards it, or I can get in my car and I can drive towards it. As long as I have the thing that that's going to provide me with that orientation, then I can always do something in the here and now that's going to take me towards it, even though I'll never actually arrive. You know, it's like I'll never arrive in the east, but it can always inform what I'm doing in the here and now. So when conditions aren't conducive to this, then it's important to understand that these values still exist. It's just that they can't be fully expressed. So the psychologist Carl Rogers, which I'm sure most everybody's familiar with, he was the originator of person-centered therapy. He talked about how the potatoes in his cellar would send out shoots towards the light. They kept on trying to grow into potato plants, even though they weren't able to, because they weren't in the right conditions to do that. And he found something similar was happening with his clients, that they were trying to grow and express their positive values, but poor life circumstances and poor short-term strategies were getting in the way of that happening, right? It's sort of like their values were living in a cellar of their prior conditioning. So he saw his work as providing an unconditional positive environment so that his clients' values could naturally express themselves. And we can do something similar when we start taking these motivational approaches. Okay, so now it's important for us to understand a little bit about, excuse me, now that I've spent some time actually going over values and how we can understand them and why they're so important. The next question becomes, how do we start to solicit values? And there's a few different ways in which we can go about doing this. So we've got nice tools that we can use in terms of like the motivational interviewing sorting cards, for example. Those are now, you can find those online. So you can use those online, or you can get the paper version of those. You also have IMR. So IMR, Illness Management and Recovery, that first section on recovery is an exploration of values. Initially, as the person is starting to formulate goals, right? So you can use IMR, that initial one, to start exploring and investigating with the client what it is that they value, and then how they might start developing goals, which is just the thing that they're going to do to start moving in that direction. You could use something like the magic wand question. So with a magic wand question, we would ask, well, what would your life look like if we could take away all of your current problems? So like we could just take away all of the challenges around what you're struggling with in terms of your mental health, what do you imagine that your life would look like? So they can get a sense, they can start reconnecting with that. Now, one thing that I find as I'm working with this with clients is that when we start talking about values, that it can get a little bit dry, and it cannot actually, that it actually doesn't connect with what the person really values, right? So often in community mental health, there's this sort of expectation that the client will have a goal, like a treatment goal or something like that. It's not really necessarily connecting with whatever they might personally value, but it's sort of an expectation that they have something like that. So it's not really something that's informing their life from moment to moment. So when we talk about values, it has to be something that the person actually experiences, because those values exist below the thinking mind. They're a type of emotional remembering of who you were at your best when the life circumstances came around where you felt like that you were at your highest and best. So when you're talking to somebody about their values, then they need to connect to it viscerally. They have to experience it inside of their bodies as a type of, as a yes that they're experiencing, so that they can really make that connection with, oh yeah, this is, I can actually feel what it would be like to be this kind of person that exists in my imagination of who I would be at my best. So one of the ways in which I illustrate this, and I'll go ahead and just do this pretty quickly. Let's stop sharing my screen. So as I'm talking about values with a client, one way in which I illustrate what it is that we're looking for in terms of a felt sense of a value is with this particular exercise. So sorry I didn't have time to do this before, but again, this was just sort of a last minute thing, so you'll have to bear with me. Michelle, do you want to do this exercise with me?
Sure.
Okay, so I am going to show you a picture here.
You're not changing this into Rorschach, right? You're going to send me some weird pictures that I'm going to have to decipher and let everybody know my deep dark secrets.
Nope. This is the picture that I'm going to show you. Can you see it?
Yes.
That is?
Yeah, $100.
It's $100 bill. Isn't that amazing? So, you know, check inside of your body. Are you actually having any response? I mean, you literally just saw me draw this on a piece of paper.
No.
It's kind of a bull crap.
Right.
$100 bill, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I were to just tear it in half, are you going to have any kind of response to that?
No.
Okay. Hang on there for just a second.
He's going to his personal safe to pull out a real $100 bill, I can tell.
Right.
Okay.
Close.
So now when I show this to you, do you have any kind of different response? And I wish that we were sitting in the room together, because having this in real life, you know, you will have a different response. But as you see that, are you able to identify the value of the object that I'm holding in front of you?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that something that you can connect with in terms of feeling it in your body? Like, for example, if I were to start offering it to you, say, oh, here's a $50 bill, Michelle.
I would totally accept your $50 bill.
Right, exactly right. Now, I'm going to rip this $50 bill in half, okay?
Please don't do that.
Notice what kind of response that your body has, right? Was that a little bit different from when I actually tore this in half? All I did is I pretended like I was going to tear it in half.
Yeah.
Right. So again, your body is mapping what's valuable for you, and it's not happening at the level necessarily of your cerebral cortex, right? You know, that's a $100 bill. I can ask you what it is and you can say, oh yeah, that's a $100 bill. But you're going to have an emotional response to the value if I offer it to you, or if I pretend like I'm going to tear it in half, right? Mm-hmm. That's connecting to the value of that $100 bill. Now, in reality, there's no difference between what I'm holding up here and this. They're both pieces of paper that have ink on them. But your body is able to distinguish between these two based on your learning history. Why? Because you've had really good experiences with this, and you haven't necessarily had those same experiences with this, right? So you've mapped that. And now you have access to that as part of your learning history. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. Okay, so we can use a similar approach. I'll start sharing here again, to help the client start to explore their values. And oops. Here we go. And I do this with a practice I like to call remembering forward. So we want the person to start creating their North Star. And they can do that through starting to create for themselves a compelling image of the embodiment of what it is that they truly value. Again, that's a sense of their best self. You know, if you walk up to a kid and you ask them, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? They're going to probably tell you, right? You know, and they'll tell you without hesitation, and you're going to see that they're going to light up when they do it, right? Yeah. I want to be the king of the universe. There's going to be something, right? Like, maybe back in the day it would be like, I want to be a doctor, something like that, right? They're seeing themselves as the possibility of who they could be, right? And then that provides a direction. Okay. So we want to try to do something similar with our clients. Again, the way that I do this is through a practice I call remembering forward. And so what we do is we sit down together and I ask the person to come up with 1 or 2 life moments where they knew that they were at their best self, right? And everybody's got a moment when something amazing happened that's not necessarily related to, like, say, using meth or something like that, like some life circumstance, something happened in the environment that was an amazing experience and could be a peak moment. So everybody's got a moment where the sun peeked through the clouds, at least for a moment or two. And those are the things that we want to try to reconnect the person to so that they can feel that inside of their body, right? Their body has mapped that as a memory. And we all have that somewhere inside. So once you've identified, it's got to be at least one, but hopefully a person has had more than one, and there are 2 or 3 that you're able to access, and then you can have the person really get into it. So what did that feel like? Can they feel it viscerally in their body, like Michelle was able to viscerally feel the value of that $50 bill? And that's what we want them to connect with, and then to start asking questions about that. So what were you thinking at that time about yourself or the people around you? How might you have felt about your prospects moving forward? And what kind of a person did you see yourself becoming? So the idea is for them to really savor that experience as much as possible. Then the next part of the exercise is to imagine a time in the future where they're living their best life. And what would that be like? And again, they can construct in their imagination sort of a memory, right? They're doing it with their imagination, but it's like they're remembering their best self in a future time where they're living their best life. And what would that look like? And again, the important thing here is to look for shifts in the person's presentation, right? It's a dry exercise. This isn't going to really connect. What we really want to see is, does the person seem more alive? Do their eyes brighten? Are they smiling? The point of the exercise is to have the person actually experience the felt sense of what they value, just like you were able to experience the felt sense of that $50 bill. So that's remembering forward. And it's something that you can use with your client just as a way of kind of like getting things started, because anything that we do has to connect with what it is that we truly value. That's what motivation at its heart is all about, is being able to identify what it is that you really want. Now, change happens in a fairly definable sequence. So if a person is going to make a change, right? So their life is the way that it is now. They see themselves as a future best self. The steps that they take towards that best self are going to represent the changes that they're going to make in their lives, right? And that's going to follow a series of steps. Beginning with that the change isn't really going to be on the person's, it's not really on their map right now, right? They're not really thinking about making change. They're really stuck in whatever sort of short-term compensatory patterns that they have, whether that's substance use or whether it's isolation, or whether it's acting out on maybe voices or paranoid ideation, whatever it is that they're doing in the short term. To the degree in which they're not seeing any way of moving forward, or the possibility of it, or that there's any desire for it, then they're in the pre-contemplation stage, so that there's no intention, there's no specific explicit intention about changing a behavior. And where the client is here, then we want to use our stages of change strategy, or our stages of treatment approaches to pre-contemplation by really focusing on our engagement strategies, right? So we're trying to draw the client in, and eventually what we would like to have are these types of discussions about who they would be at their best self, right? But initially, they have to just be around for us to have those conversations with them. So our engagement strategies are how we get there. Then when the person's in contemplation, that's where they're starting to have some kind of a sense of, oh yeah, maybe I would like to move forward in my life this way, right? Maybe I would like to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Maybe I would like to have someplace that I could really call a home. Maybe I'd like to have improved relationships with my family. Maybe there's some things that I gave up. I used to play the violin. Maybe that's something that I could really reconnect to, right? That image of themselves at their best, that's the thing that we want to try to get them oriented towards. And then what's going to happen? There's going to be a gap between who it is that they are now and the type of person that they want to become. And that gap is the place where the ambivalence exists, right? Because then they're going to have to start doing things that are going to be different from all of the short-term strategies that they've learned. So there's reasons for doing it, staying the same, and there's reasons for changing. That's where we get ambivalence, and that's where the person's in the contemplation stage. And that ambivalence is something that has to be resolved in order for the person to move forward in their lives, right? So contemplation is where the person is aware that there's this problem in terms of there's a gap between where they're at now and where they would like to get. There's not necessarily a commitment towards that actions. And again, the person is sort of stuck in between wanting it and wanting things to stay the same. Now, when the client moves into the preparation stage, this is where they make a commitment to change behavior. They're going to start doing something. And this is where they start planning out mentally what the concrete steps are that are going to take them in the direction of moving towards that life value, right? So they're going to start thinking about concrete steps. I'm going to actually need to do X, Y, and Z in order for me to get to where it is that I want to go. Now, one thing that it's important to recognize is that even when somebody's trying to eliminate a behavior, the reason why they're trying to eliminate it is because they're trying still to get to that best version of themselves. So let's take a smoker for an example. Somebody that wants to quit smoking, that's a type of change that they're going to engage in, but that's in the interest of them being who they see themselves to be as a healthy person. Right? So that might be somebody that can start going on hikes again, or somebody that can spend time with their grandchildren. There's all sorts of things in which the person is seeing that they'll be able to do and the person that they'll be able to come. It's not the elimination of the behavior that's important. That's just the thing that has to happen for them to move forward in their life. So when they start making concrete plans about how it is that they're going to do that, then we can say that they're in the preparation stage. They're ready to actually start taking steps towards their North Star. Then the action stage of change is where they're learning new skills and strategies in order to move in that direction. So for some people, it might just be straightforward. They don't really need a lot of help. They know what to do. But for a lot of us, we need a little bit of coaching around how it is that we're going to actually move in that direction. So we need to learn some new skills. We need to learn some new coping strategies, and we're going to have to solve some problems along the way. And that's when we're in the action stage of change. Now, generally speaking, if somebody's going to take if they're going to do any kind of big change in their lives, then that's going to require that they really focus on developing those skills and solving those problems in order for them to make that change. So you can see that there's going to be a period here in the action stage where the person really needs to be dedicated to making those kinds of changes. It's kind of like they have to put the practice in. And then once they do that, and they've been able to successfully change some or a lot of their behaviors enough to move forward in their lives, then those changes are going to have to integrate in their lives in some way or another. So the person is going to have to be able to take those changes and make them work with the rest of their life, right? So if we go back to the example of the smoker, maybe the person did whatever it is that they needed to do to quit smoking. They got the lozenges. They started, like not going to places where they knew that they were going to smoke. Maybe they even started avoiding family and friends because they all smoke. At a certain point, if the person's not going to stay completely isolated, then they have to figure out how that change is going to integrate with the rest of their lives. And that's when the person is at the maintenance stage. And again, if we have some kind of a sense of where the person is at, then we can help them get to the next step. So with contemplation, where the person's in contemplation, and preparation, we can use our motivational interviewing strategies. When they're in the action stage of change, then we can use our cognitive behavioral strategies to coach and teach skills and help the person problem solve. When the person's in maintenance, then this is where we start working with a relapse prevention plan or wellness plan, and we're really focused on, okay, now it's time to start looking at work or employment or so forth and so on, right? Get the person back into their life with the changes that they've made. Okay. Now, along the way, this is not a linear process, obviously. And the person, especially where there is big change that has to happen, then we can expect that the person is going to fall down a time or two and that there are going to be relapses along the way. It's just part of the process. But again, think about it like you learned how to walk, right? If you fell down and then you said to yourself, oh my gosh, this walking is never going to happen, I'm a complete failure, and you never stood up and tried to walk again, then you would have never learned how to walk. And, I think without exception that most of us probably fell down a lot as we were learning how to walk. So that was a pretty big change that we wanted to make, from laying on the floor to getting up and walking around. We did that through successive approximation. Essentially, what you did is you kept on falling down. And it was the falling down that taught you how to walk. So failure is part of the process. Failure doesn't mean that the person has done anything wrong, where a person has these kinds of relapses or where they fall back. That's just a version of falling down. And the more times that a person attempts at making a change, then the more likely that they are to succeed, just like you succeeded in learning how to walk, literally by falling down. It's how we do it. All right, I'm going to skip that. And then we are going to dive into motivational theory and practice. More specifically, we're going to be talking about MI. But let me stop here because I've covered quite a bit, and I just want to see if there are any thoughts or questions about what I've presented so far, anything that I can cover in a little bit more depth, or observations that you might have as we're kind of going along here. Feel free to use the chat box too, if we have one, which we do. All right, so I'm assuming everybody's on board. They understand the importance of values, why it's so critical in doing this kind of work. Got a very good sense of the stages of change, how that relates to stages of treatment. So we're all good there. Let's go ahead and move on to talking about motivational interviewing strategy. Oh, Haley. Yes.
Yeah, actually, I have a quick question. I was just wondering if you have like any tips or tricks for like unlocking best self when like you have a client who's maybe experiencing pretty substantial depressive symptoms. I just know, like for me personally, I've had clients where, it's really hard for them to even imagine a past time where they felt good because that depression is just so heavy on their mind. So I was curious if you have any sort of ways of unlocking when there may be some blocking that's happening there.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Haley. So, from a CBT approach, sometimes where somebody is really stuck in these kinds of like depressive patterns where they really can't connect to it, right? Then we might take an approach where we do a behavioral activation approach. And we might say, hey, for a little while, what we're going to experiment with is doing something that you imagine would bring you a sense of either mastery or pleasure. And we'll experiment with doing that thing first, and then we'll see how it is that you respond to it. So that's the behavioral activation approach, where we're going to, at least for a little while, try and experiment where we'll do things that you create a list together from, things that would be super easy to do to things that would be a little bit more difficult or medium level to do, all the way up to more difficult things. And then together, you can start trying those things out. And when you do those things, what do you notice? You can have the person rate themselves on a scale from 1 to 100, where 100 is like, I feel terrible. I still feel totally depressed. 1 is I feel completely enlivened by doing this. You can have them start tracking, and that tracking and noticing how things shift over time. Again, their worm brain is going to start glomming onto that and start getting it. Oh yeah, if I do X, Y, and Z, then I'm going to start feeling better. And then they're going to be more likely to do it. Now, obviously, none of this is a magic bullet, right? And we've got people that we work with that are really entrenched. So the way in which I recommend looking at this and using these kinds of approaches is just doing this as consistently as possible. Let's say that a person has we give a person a 5% chance of being able to move forward in that. We would never do this, but let's just say that that the person's chances of moving forward in their lives are low. We always assume that the person's going to make the change. But even if it's low, we can improve our odds with them, right? So it's kind of like we're loading a set of dice. So if the person had a 5% chance of being able to make a change, then with our consistent change strategy, now the person has a 10% chance of being able to make that change, or a 15% chance of being able to make that change. So one of the key principles here is that we never know when or why a person is going to make a change. That's between them and their own physiology. That's a mysterious process. What we can do is that we can try to provide the right context for that change to take place, right? We're going to try to take that potato out of the potato cellar and get it into some nice soil, and we're going to cross our fingers and hope for the best, right? Because if we've done that, then we've done our jobs. We've done what we can do. So look at it from that perspective, right? That we're just going for consistency and applying the strategies to the best degree that we can. So thanks for asking that question, and I hope that you were okay with me riffing on it a little bit.
Looks like there's a question in the chat too, Jeff.
Sure.
Where did it go? How do you address best life when they've also got negative feelings? A few tips, please.
Okay, so when they're feeling, tell me a little bit more about what you're talking about. So they're getting into a best life situation, and there's some complex feelings about it. Am I understanding that right? Well, just assuming that that's the question, yeah, let me give you a couple of tips. So I'll give you the box tip, which is this. So we're going for a certain something. Now, what's true with values is values is also the place where you get hurt. So values are kind of a complex thing. If you didn't care about something, then if you didn't have it, or if it was taken away from you, or whatever, if there was a problem with it, then you wouldn't be able to feel the pain around it, right? So if we go back to the $50 bill example, the only reason why any of you flinched while I was doing that is because you valued the $50 bill. So there's always going to be ambivalence around starting to work with values. But what we want the person to do to the best degree that they can is to feel the positive aspect of the value. So we can say, we're just going to do this for a few seconds. And we're just going to feel into it for a moment or two so you can savor it. And I say, this is like sipping a nice tea, right? We're just going to allow ourselves in the moment to have the nice tea, and we're not going to worry about anything else. So what we're going to do is we're going to put other worries and concerns into a box, and they're going to be really safe in that box. And we're going to make sure that we get back into whatever the concerns and worries are after we've had a chance to really feel the value. So let's put those concerns in the box for now, and if they can come out, if they come up again, then you can say, oh, we'll make sure that we get to this. But for right now, you can be in this safe box, and we're just going to experience the positive value with whatever it is that memory or that peak moment was. So was that helpful?
Hey,
Put it in a
Jeff.
box.
Jeff, can you talk a little bit, just even in your language in regards to helping clients do some of the stuff, even in the language in your examples, you're not necessarily given options and saying, hey, do you want to do this? It's more of that assertive language that you're using. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, the assertive language? Yeah. So choice is actually that causes people generally distress. We don't like distress, or we don't like choice. If you go into a grocery store, then having all of those different options creates a little bit of anxiety for you. And this is actually exploited all the time. If you're given a lot of choices, then there's ways of manipulating a person into the choice that the other person wants them to have made, because we experience that as being anxious. So autonomy is important. It's very, very important. So you can say, I would like to do X and make it specific. Like, I would like to do this exercise. Would that be okay with you? And then you leave it at that. We're not, you don't want to try to offer all of these different kinds of things, this or that, because then you're putting the person into a place where their threat responses are going to be naturally activated, and then they're going to default. If you've gotten them finally into the learning mode or the adaptive mode, then you'll pop them out of it. So you just want to say, here's the thing that we're going to do. Like, I'm the person that is going to hold the safety of this experience, the container of this experience, and this is the thing that I'd like for us to experiment with. Is that okay? Does that answer the question, Andre? Okay, so let's get back to MI in a nutshell. Okay, so we were talking about, this is stuff for that contemplation stage that the client might find themselves in, where they're starting to recognize, oh, here's the version of myself where I'm at the highest and best, and then here's where I'm at now. So this experience of wanting two incompatible things at the same time is where ambivalence originates from. So I like to use this example. Maybe some of you are sick of this example because you've heard it before and you're like starting to roll your eyes right now. But I like to use this example of a trip to Rio. And when I came up with this, I must have really wanted to go to Rio. I never got there. I guess I never went through the change process in order to get to Rio, unfortunately. But anyways, think about it like, again, we're just trying to think about a trip or a journey. So let's say that you wanted to go on a trip to Rio. But getting to Rio is going to require some work. You might have to save some money. You've got all of this hassle of getting a passport. You're going to have to buy suntan lotion at Kmart. It's going to be a terrible experience, right? I have to walk into Kmart. That's awful. So it might be easier instead for you to lay on the couch and eat potato chips instead, right? You'll have a short-term coping strategy, because doing all that stuff to get Rio seems like it's hard. Laying on the couch and eating potato chips, well, that's something expedient that you can do right now. And it has the tremendous advantage that you're going to be able to avoid walking into a Kmart. So you want to go to Rio, right? Because this is the thing that you want. You know that you want to go to Rio, but at the same time, you don't want to be exposed to all the hassle. So you're going to want to lay on the couch at the same time. Now, because you can't do that, this is going to, if you're conscious or aware that there's a gap there, then there's going to be kind of tension between where you're at now and where you want to get to. This is your worm brain that's trying to push you forward. It's going to do that by making you feel uncomfortable. So if that resolves in the direction of going to Rio, right? If you get yourself together and you do what you need to do in order to handle all those things that you don't want to do, and you go on the trip to Rio, then you're living your values. That's an expression of your values. And you get, as a result, maybe some amazing things will happen. Like you get a suntan, you got some awesome vacation photos. And those are the things that are going to provide you with further mapping for your worm brain. It's like you're patting your worm brain and you're saying, good job, worm brain. And it's going to remember it. And then it's going to keep on being at the forefront of moving you forward in your life. Now, let's say instead that you stuff that type of tension instead, and you're committed to your short-term coping strategy of laying on the couch. And then as a result, you're still going to get some stuff. There'll still be consequences in this case. Maybe you get watch a lot of reruns as you're laying there, but eventually as a long-term consequence, you're probably going to get heart disease and become obese as a result. And those are all of the negative long-term consequences of not listening to your worm brain. Okay, so to understand this dynamic, you can think of how pole is created in a magnet. It just happens this way, where you've got two opposites that are naturally generating it. And we experience tension related to ambivalence a little bit like this. So they just occur naturally as long as we want two things at the same time, and that's going to exert pressure to change as long as that remains true. So this is an internal process as long as a second person doesn't come along and assume one of the poles of the magnet. When that happens, then you're going to assume the opposite pole, and now you're sharing this tension. And this is a little bit like, as you can see here in the illustration, like two people that are pulling on a rope. Now, back in the day, before we had such a sophisticated knowledge of how this works, we used to call this client resistant, right? It's like the client has lack of insight, or the client isn't motivated. But in truth, this could just as easily be described as clinician resistance, or clinician lack of insight, or clinician lack of motivation, because you have two people that are doing this together. Like neither one of you are connected with your values. You're just struggling over the thing that one person's trying to avoid and the other person is trying to force on them. So as long as somebody comes and picks up the other side of the rope, then you're going to start making an argument against the change as they're pulling for the change. Okay, so what we need to keep in mind is that we don't need to pull in an opposite direction. We've got millions of years of evolution that are doing that work for us. So like, why should we get involved? Where there are unhelpful habits, the tension is going to be there, because that's just the way, again, in which you evolved. Being stuck is aversive. We don't like that. Because that's true, there's always going to be some incentive to make change somewhere. Okay, so when we think about what is required for us to facilitate motivation, motivational interviewing techniques can be thought of as this person-centered exploration of the person's values and goals, right? So the values are the directions, the goals are the things that the person can start doing in the here and now. And we're trying to help the person focus or resolve their ambivalence towards starting to take those steps towards the thing that's important. So the first thing that the person has to have is the can do. They have to connect with that value. It's got to be driven by the worm brain. So they have to have the want to. That's the internal motivation for the change. And then they have to have the can do. And the can do is self-efficacy, right? So that's your confidence that you're going to be able to make the change. Where there's no confidence that you'll ever be able to execute it, then obviously you're not going to engage in the steps in order to do that. Now, some of that is the person needs to learn skills, but some of it is just confidence, building some confidence that yes, if they wanted to make this change, that they would be capable of doing it. And then finally here, the person has to have the will do. So often when we're using motivational interviewing techniques, we get stuck in the want to and the can do. We never get around to the will do. And change can't happen unless the person starts walking in the direction of their value, right? So the can do are the steps that the person is starting to take. Those are the commitments towards actually making that change. They need to commit to it, and then they have to start envisioning in their mind steps that they're going to take towards it, and then there's some willingness to take a step, right? So even if the person takes a small step, then they're going to get some feedback from that worm brain that yes, you're headed in the right direction, and then that's going to make the next step much more likely. Okay, so we don't want to pick up the rope, and we can do this by first understanding that the client has a real dilemma. Behaviors are functional. I'm sure a lot of you have heard me say this before. They're functional. So they've been reinforced over time. They serve purposes. Even if those purposes now are completely dysfunctional, they're serving some kind of a purpose, right? Whether it's relief from pain or other types of suffering, whether it's providing a person with a sense of meaning, whatever it is that we do, if it's a deliberate behavior, then we're doing it for a reason. So we can see this and we can understand that understanding back to the client. That's how you express natural, accurate empathy rather, right? I get it. I understand why it is that you're doing it. I can see that this is a dilemma and why it would be so hard. And then from there, we want to help the client form their own reasons for making positive change and to help make more conscious this natural tension between what the status quo is and doing something that would be a little bit more in alignment with what the person values. So during this process, again, we should always be cognizant of picking up the rope, because if we pick up the rope, then that's where the change is going to stop. So the client's going to express ambivalence. Start looking at ambivalence as actually being a positive sign, right? Where that's occurring, then the person is on the first steps forward. They're at least out of the pre-contemplation stage, and they're thinking about making the change. And that's an important, necessary step. So change is something that's difficult, as we all know. During this process, then we reassure our clients that they're the ones that are in the driver's seats. That's promoting autonomy, that they're the experts. It is their worm brain, after all, that's pulling them forward. So they're going to be the experts in their situation, their current condition, and what the best steps are going to be in order for them to move forward in their lives. Now, throughout our interactions with our clients, we can hold on to this certain kind of mindset that's at the heart of motivational interviewing, but I'd also suggest here that it's a key to good therapy in general. So first of all, you have a partnership with a person. So it's going to be a collaboration. It's something that's done for and with the client. So this should look a lot more like a dance than a struggle or a confrontation. And second, you have compassion, so that you're looking to promote the client's well-being and you're committed to what is in the person's best interest. Third, we have evocation, so we're eliciting from the client their own ideas about making change. And in some ways, this is similar to what we do in cognitive restructuring. So we take a cognitive restructuring approach, then the person is starting to make their own arguments about, let's say they have this thought, I'm a failure, right? So they can start making their own arguments that they're not a failure by looking for evidence to the contrary. This is a similar approach that we're doing with motivational interviewing techniques, where we're soliciting from the person their own arguments about making change. So we don't have to do it for them. And again, those arguments are going to sort of essentially be the worm brain taking over and making arguments for change. Okay, and then finally here we have acceptance, and there's just a couple of things on acceptance that I want to touch on here that I think are pretty important to understand. The first one here is that no matter what the person's current condition is, that they're still capable of rediscovering and moving towards what they value. That's what is at the heart of the recovery mindset. And how we see it as clinicians, how we see a person's circumstances as a clinician is what we're going to convey to them. So it's important that we still hold on to this notion that inside of the person that this worm brain exists, right? And that given the right circumstances, that the opportunities will open up for the person to move towards that. So this is kind of like where we're keeping the door open until the person can walk through it themselves. And then second, we're going to accept that ambivalence is something that it's normal and it's acceptable, and that its presence and the natural pressure that it's exerting towards change is something that's in fact valuable and life affirming. And we want to learn, what we want to learn how to do is to assist the client in catching that current and riding it towards their recovery. All right, I'm just going to briefly touch on change talk here because I'm seeing that we're running a little long in the presentation part. So change talk is where we are soliciting this type of talk from the client. So it's just speech that favors movement in the direction of a change. Is essentially you're just getting the person's worm brain to start talking. In favor of a particular change target that's in alignment with what the person values. So these would be things like, man, I really know that this would be good for me if I did this, or I've been thinking about trying to do something different, blah, blah, blah. We just want to start soliciting this kind of talk so that the client can start making arguments themselves. And there's a couple of ways in which we can go about doing this. The first is a payoff matrix. And the payoff matrix is just a way of talking about change in terms of the pros and cons of staying the same. So the pros and cons of the status quo or whatever the person is doing right now, and the pros and cons of making the change. So you're gonna look at it from both angles and from both sides. So you start out with the advantages of staying the same, and then you look at the disadvantages of change, right? So if you look at it from the example of substance use, for example, then it would be, if the person's using substances right now, then it would be the advantages of using substances. And then you would look at the disadvantages of using substances. So look at how this is a natural progression. If we start out with the advantages of using substances, then you can express accurate empathy as the person's talking about all the reasons why they're doing it. And then you're going to solicit change talk by then getting the conversation moved towards the disadvantages of using substances. Similarly, when we go to the advantages and disadvantages of making change, you want to start out with, well, what would be the disadvantages of making a change, right? That's the place where you're going to start. And then you're going to flip that around and solicit change talk by starting to talk about the advantages of making the change. So when it comes to substance use, that would be the disadvantages of not using substances and the advantages. Now, we can follow this up by using motivational interviewing rulers. So with motivational interviewing rulers, that's where we ask the person to, on a scale from 1 to 10, rate themselves in terms of how motivated they are to make a change and how confident they feel in making that change. So I want to just give you a brief illustration of how it is this works so that you can see it in motion. So Andre, do you mind unmuting for a second?
Yeah.
Okay, so would you mind sharing with us, it doesn't have to be a major disclosure here, but everybody's got something in their life that they'd like to at least tweak a little bit. So do you got something that you can share with me in terms of little life tweak that you'd like to make?
I'll choose something that my wife would like me to tweak: the amount of sports I watch.
Oh, okay. All right. So we're going to start out with the amount of, okay. Is this does this have any alignment with your own worm brain?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And the value there would be that you would like your wife to be happy and to have better connection with her.
That's fair.
Okay. Yeah. So let's establish the ground that we're going to be working on. Okay. So in order to make this change, I'm curious on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is you don't really care if it happens or not. You know, this is just like, I'm just going to say a thing or two just to get this person off my back, but I really have no motivation to change. 10 is like, oh my God, this change absolutely has to happen. My worm brain is screaming. So where do you find yourself on a scale from 1 to 10?
I'd probably say about a 4.
Okay. Now, why would you say a 4 as opposed to a 1 or a 2?
Probably because there is some external pressure to change being put upon me, but also there's a part of me that maybe in that pre-contemplative stage that can think about some positives that could arise if I were to change.
Right. So while on some level you're experiencing like, it's something that my wife wants to do, you can still see the benefits because you would increase the kind of positive connection that you have with your wife.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's it. Did I have to make the argument for him, or did I just use his own argument and reflect it back to him? Did I get any resistance? Nope. None. Okay. So this is what we want to do to start soliciting change talk. If it comes from the person, then there's no resistance. I didn't have to make an argument. Hey, Andre, it's super lame that you're watching a lot of sports. You really have to cut that out.
Oh.
What kind of response are you having now?
Flashbacks.
You're probably likely to tell me to
a little angst, like, give me a minute, it's almost over. you know, a little defensiveness.
Right. Yeah. You're inclined to mount an argument, right?
Yes.
That's what we want to avoid. So these are the ways in which we can do that. Okay. So we want to use these rulers in order to start soliciting change talk. And then we can get to doing something like, oh, okay, well, Andre, if you want to make this change, and it seems like that you feel pretty motivated to do it, why don't you and I look at a payoff matrix? Well, we'll look at the pros and cons of doing what it is that you're doing now, which is way too much sports watching, or to make the change, which would be that you would be, spending a little bit more time with your wife that you were using watching sports. So then we would go over the pros and cons of staying the same and the pros and cons of changing. And I'd elicit a little bit more change talk, I suspect. Okay, so I have gone on at some length here, and I don't know if we're going to actually get to the breakouts because we got 15 minutes left, essentially, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you an example of using a payoff matrix with a client, if I can find it. So, give me a minute here. And I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to optimize for sound so that you can hear it. And this is me and my colleague Shannon going over a payoff matrix for medications. We won't go through the whole thing because we don't have time enough to do it. So we'll just watch like maybe the first 12 or 13 minutes or so.
All right. So Shannon, thanks for sharing with me that you did go off of your medications. And I really do appreciate that. So, when you share those things with me, then that allows us to talk about it. And so I do appreciate that. And I'm wondering if you would be interested in having a discussion about your medications, not where, I'm telling you what you should do or what you shouldn't do, but rather us exploring the pros and cons of using medications together. And from my perspective, I just want you to be able to move forward in your life in the way that's going to be consistent with the things that are really important to you, with what your values are, and so that you can live your best life. And, for a lot of people, medications can be very helpful in that regard, but not necessarily. So I don't really have I don't have an opinion either way. My interest is just in supporting you and having the kind of life that you want to live. So there's an interesting way of exploring this, and it's called a payoff matrix. And with a payoff matrix, what we do together is that we look at the pros and cons of doing something and the pros and cons of not doing something. So in this case, we would look at the pros and cons of not being on the medications and the pros and cons of being on the medications. And if we do that together, then you can get a pretty good picture of how medications may be helpful for you, and how maybe they might have been not as helpful for you, so that you can make a good choice about how it is that you're using your medications. So I'd like to try to get you in the driver's seat there, so that you feel like that you're making choices that are based in your best interest, rather than just simply being told to do something or feeling like that you're not being listened to. So does that sound like something that you'd be interested in doing with me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So here I brought up a payoff matrix, and as you can see, we're going to go over the advantages of not being on the medications, the disadvantages of not being on the medications, the disadvantages of being on the medications, the advantages of being on the medication. So we're going to take a very thorough look at this together, okay? You're gonna look at it from all different angles. So starting out with the advantages of not being on the medications, I'm sure there are probably some pretty good reasons for you to go off the medications, right? So let's get those listed. What are some of the advantages that you see of not being on the medications?
I don't gain weight.
All right.
Not hungry all the time, it feels like.
Weight. All the time. Okay, yeah, those are some pretty good reasons. Any other reasons why there would be some advantages of not being on the medications?
I feel like I'm sharper, like I can catch things that are happening with my neighbors that they're doing to mess with me and stuff. So
Okay, feel like you're sharper, you can catch more things. What else comes to mind?
I don't have to remember to do something every day, you know, like take the meds.
That's sure can be a pretty big hassle, huh? Okay, so in terms of the advantages, we've got that you don't feel that you're not going to gain weight, so you're not hungry all the time, feels like that you're sharper, you're catching more things, and you don't have the hassle of taking meds. Okay, so let's go over to talking about the disadvantages of not being on the medication. So what do you notice in terms of when you're not on the medications? What are some of those disadvantages?
My mom's mad about it.
It's bad. Anything else in terms of disadvantages?
Not really.
What do you notice in terms of, so you notice that your relationship with your mom gets a little bit worse. Do you notice anything else in terms of when you're not on your medication, just your relationships to other people?
I don't know. I'm not really sure, I guess.
Okay, so not quite as sure how, not sure how that affects your relationships. What about in terms of what it is that you're doing? So when you're not on the medications, you're getting out, you're doing the things that you normally do, or do you find that there are some things that you'd normally be doing that's sort of representative of your best self that you're doing or maybe you're not doing?
I can't go out because, you know, the neighbors are threatening me, so I'm definitely spending more time inside. I don't want to run into them.
Okay, so you find yourself you're isolating more?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't go out unless.
And feels like you can't go out.
Yeah.
Okay. So as you're sitting there thinking about the disadvantages, does anything else pop into your mind?
Not really.
Okay. Relationships. Just clean things up here a little bit. Okay. I know that you're isolating more. Okay. So just in terms of the disadvantages of not being on the medications, your mom's getting more mad, you're not sure how that affects other relationships, and you're finding that you're isolating more, and it feels like that you can't go out. Okay. So let's go over and talk a little bit about some of the disadvantages of being on the medication. So when you're on the medications, what do you find challenging about that?
I feel like, I don't know, I feel like I'm just a sick person that has to take meds all the time. And it's a lot of pills.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so when you take the medications, the feeling that you have about yourself is that you're a sick person.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can definitely see how that is. That's something that's difficult. It's challenging for sure. What else do you notice about the disadvantages of being on the medications?
I put on 50 pounds since I started medications.
Okay. Weight gain.
I feel like I don't want to date.
Eight. Okay. What else comes to mind?
Mm,
What do you notice in terms of the side effects of the medications?
well, they told me I might gain weight and I might feel hungry. And I definitely feel that. And then I just don't feel like, I don't know, I can feel kind of foggy sometimes. And that worries me because with the neighbors being threatening, I don't want to, I feel like I need to be like on my game, you know?
Okay, so you don't feel like you're as much on your game.
No. I just don't feel like it's like sharp, I guess, or clear, you know?
Okay. Can you help me understand this a little bit more? So is it that you feel more dull? You're not feeling as sharp, or is it that you're not as worried about it?
Worried about what?
Worried about what's going on with your neighbors, the concerns that you have about your neighbors. So are those thoughts less in your mind, or do you just feel more dull in general? Do you feel hazy, foggy, or is it more that you're just not worried about it as much?
I guess I'm not. Both. I guess both.
Okay. Do you mind if we separate those out?
Sure.
Okay. So one is that you're less worried about it, and so you feel like that you're missing something.
Yeah.
And then the other is that you feel more foggy, hazy, less sharp.
Yeah.
Okay. And then finally here we have the advantages of being on the medications. And where would you see some of the advantages? So, you know, just in terms of, again, if we think about the things that are important to you, do you notice a difference of being on your medications where you would describe those as being, well, yeah, actually, that has been an advantage to me.
I mean, my mom and I get along.
Okay.
And, like,
Yeah, that's huge.
she is important. She's always important to me too.
Do you notice do you notice this with other relationships, that it just seems like, you know, I know that your mom's really invested. So if you're not taking your medications and she gets upset, and that makes the relationship more difficult. But just in terms of when you're on your medications, getting along with other people, having better relationships, is that something that you've noticed?
I think I probably like I see I mean I'm leaving. I leave the house more. My mom has also shared that actually. And I guess that I do. I leave more. So like I've gone out to lunch a couple of times with my girlfriend.
Yeah, that's a pretty important relationship for you, huh?
Yeah.
Since you've been off your meds, have you called her or talked to her or done anything with her?
We text, but we haven't seen each other.
Okay. And so get along with your mom better, you leave your house more. Anything else in terms of, what about just stuff, getting normal stuff done? You know, like taking care of errands and grocery shopping and
Yeah.
making appointments.
Yeah. I mean, I leave the house more when, I mean, I'm able to pay more attention to the neighbors when I'm not on the medication. Like I said, I'm catching more things, so I don't go out as much. But I work.
So yeah, so this is just an illustration of how it is that you can use a payoff matrix. And again, notice what happened there. Did I make any argument for her to start using her medications again? I let her do all of her arguing for her, right? And what I did is that I continually went back to showing accurate empathy. So I wasn't making an argument. I wasn't picking up a rope when she was offering all the reasons why she wanted to discontinue her medications. And then I kept pinging her worm brain in terms of what her values are, right? Good relationships, you know, being able to do normal adult occupations in terms of taking care of ourselves and having independence, right? Those are the things that you're trying to highlight, right? And then the person is going to take over for themselves once they understand and they've reconnected to what's actually important to them. So I don't have to make any argument. Now, what we didn't have time to see here as at the end is that I asked her to take one step forward, and that was that we were going to together go and talk to her psychiatrist about medications, that whether it would make sense to decrease the amount of medications that she was taking, or if there's some way that we could tweak them to address her concerns, which is a step that we were going to take together. So that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next month.